Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 1. We're at the beginning of Discourse 33, bottom of page 255. And we finished chapter 131, and we're going to go to 132. 131 rather, is continuing. We're discussing now the two energy flows in existence. One called Eir HaGvul, one called Eir HaBligvul, or Eir Pnimin, Eir Makif. Immanent energy, which is tailored and focused and targeted to a particular function, and transcendent energy, which is not focused to anything particular, but just representing emanating and representing and expressing the source, is essentially the difference between the Avis, the patriarchs, and their work before Matan Torah, which was really making sure that the energy within existence is aligned perfectly with the Creator, with God, with the source, and Matan Torah, which we didn't get to yet, which creates a chiddush that brings in an Eir HaBligvul that's higher than existence. So to continue elaborating about the Avis, the chapter 131 continued and said that this Gili of Kel Shaddai that we said about the Avis, Kel Shaddai is what? Shaddai, is also the meaning and the explanation in the Medrash that says from Avram, when Avram began, he began to radiate. Miheir Memizrach. He says, in general, this is the level of Eir Zarua Latzadik. So chapter 131, you could say, is an explanation of the meaning of Eir Zarua. What does it mean, Eir Zarua? So literally, Eir Zarua Latzadik, the energy, the light that is implanted then in the Tzadik, Eir Zarua Latzadik, and given to the Tzadik, to a righteous person. So poetically, we understand what it means, that a Tzadik essentially inherits or gains the Eir Zarua. But what is the Ruah? So Ruah is an interesting word because it means plant, an implantation. So Eir Zarua. So to explain this, the Rebbe Rashab began by discussion by saying, based on the Pasuk Eliyahu, that said, the expression is Chakim hu antu Chakim v'lei b'chochmi yediyah, antu Mevin v'lei b'bina yediyah, which means God is a dimension of Chochmah and Bina. So it's Chochmah and Bina, but it's not knowable Chochmah and Bina, meaning it's not something that we can relate to, but it's also not outside of the realm of the structure of Chochmah and Bina. So he says this, I must say, refers to Chochmah and Bina that's higher than Atzilus. Because in Atzilus, it's clearly knowable, and he proves it through many different ways. In Atzilus, we know, we appreciate the wisdom and the Bina. So when we say, Les machshava tfisa beklal, which is what he says in Pasuk Eliyahu earlier, we have to say we're talking about a level that's beyond. Okay. Then he continues on that says that Atzilus in general is Gilead Helam, as the Kaviz. It reveals, what does it reveal? It reveals the 10 hidden spheres that were envisioned by the cosmic artist, 10 hidden spheres from before the Tzimtzum. So therefore, basically, Atzilus reveals the Chochmah in a revealed way of that which is concealed. And what's concealed? So he says that Chakim v'lei b'chochma yediyah is either Chochmah Bina of Akudim or Chochmah Bina or Chochmah of Ak, Adam Kadmon. As the Zohar says, the Lav Inun Nehurin, that's higher than being. It's Lav Inun, it doesn't have Nehurin. Lav Inun Nehurin would be literally Lav Inun. They are not illuminators. They're powers that do not get revealed. It's like a concealed type of. They don't shine. And then he goes on and says, in the root, this is the 10 hidden spheres. And he continues to explain that this is like in the Krichas HaNefesh would be the revealed faculties when you have the vision in the eye and the hearing in the ear and the other faculties that are functioning. That's like Atzilus. But then there's the Krichas, the way they are Klolim B'Nefesh. The way they're Klolim B'Nefesh, they're already, like that would be like the 10 energies within the container, like Akudim, and even higher, the way it's Neisha Keiches, which is apparently the way it's an Ak. Yeah, it's not apparently. That's Aderech Neisha Keiches. So there's how the faculties are included in the source, in the soul, and then there's how the soul has the potential of faculties, which is even more subtle and abstract level. So now it becomes a question based on this, that we've established now that there's a Chakim Yediyah. There's a knowable wisdom and Bina and understanding. There's an unknowable wisdom and understanding, and goes all the way to the 10 hidden spheres in the root in the soul, which is at that stage, it's Pshittus, as he says, is completely without shape. So how does it go What's the process that makes sense? How does it come from a state that's completely shapeless, even though it's encompassed there, to something that's tangibly different? You have Riyah and Shmiyah, seeing and hearing, or you have a mind that's working and a heart that's feeling, or a hand that's a foot that's walking, and you have different faculties. How did that go? How did it get here? Such a tangible, distinct faculties from a place that is completely abstract. So he says there's a process, and there's a process that makes sense, and he uses the example from Teirah. So what does it say in Teirah? Pasuk Eliyahu. There he says, he qualifies that there is talking about the Kalim. There he's talking about how Chachma of Bria comes from Chachma Atzilus, the Kalim. But he says the same idea can also explain the way it is in energy, which, by the way, is the shita of this drush, that also in energy there's level, there's spheres. Right, exactly. So he says the example is of when you plant a seed in the ground. He uses the example of an apple seed. Question is, the seed does not have any of the personality, and particularly let's say the sweetness of a sweet apple. You taste the seed, and you won't have any taste. And more than that, most seeds altogether you can't even eat. So you have basically a seed turning into something that is edible, and not only edible, it has sweetness. Where did these new features come from? If the seed itself doesn't seem to have it. Doesn't have it. That's what he asked. And he says, and if we say that it's coming from the Keach HaTzemeach, meaning from the power of the growth within the earth, we see, I'm just using his Mesikas as this, there's no sweetness at all in the power of growth within the earth. Now he qualifies this and says, in some places it does say that it comes from that place, and the basis on the Rashi and Bereshis, that when they tasted, they were able to taste the earth and know the personality or the features. It had some distinct features. But he says it's still Mesikus Ruchni. At best, it's still a spiritual Mesikus. So it does contribute to answering the question, especially once we know the full answer, but it's not a full answer yet, because the question is, how does it jump from here to there? And then he says that Geras HaKedesh, that the Geras HaKedesh I think is more aligned with what he's saying here, that from the power of growth in the earth, you only get the fact that there's a fruit, but the sweetness comes from the mazel, which begins. And this leads us into the answer. So what's the answer? How does it get from this spiritual place into tangible faculties? Or how from Esespheres Agnuzis to Esespheres Agluyis? The answer is Er Zerua. That's going to be the answer. That it's an energy that is like planting a seed. So it's not just a miracle. That God says, I want 10 spheres, poop, 10 spheres. He planted a seed. The seed is going to be the 10 hidden spheres. But what's the explanation now? So the explanation is the Maimer Chazal. It says there's no grass, no blade of grass below that does not have a mazel above that strikes it. The word makah is interesting. It doesn't mean strikes it. It means it's like almost like, when you smack a horse to move. It's it's the word. It's not energized. It prods it, right? Prods it or stimulates it. That's what it means. And stimulates it to grow. So he pointed out that generally, also in the Geras HaKedesh, the expression is hamakbei ve'emerloi gadel. It says grow. The Rebbe Rashab just says Magadle. Whether this is a different lashon of the Medrash, I don't think in Havana is a difference. Because the bottom line is, through saying it makes it grow. Bottom line, it makes it grow. And here the Rebbe Rashab says, and this mazel has in it something that is sweet. But it's what? It's spiritual sweetness. And he gives the example. For example, you could have sweetness that's in a nigun. You say the word sweetness, the sweet to the taste of the palate. There's sweetness when you hear a song. There's sweetness when you hear a nice seichel, a beautiful idea. So it does not give sweetness to the physical mouth when you hear a song, but it's still chiyach ruchni. It does affect, it stimulates the taste buds, you can say, the spiritual palate. Because think about it for a moment. When you hear a nigun, there's a state where you feel nothing. Suddenly someone plays a song, he sings a song, and you feel a sweetness comes around you. Can you compare it to the sweetness when you put in your mouth a sweet apple? No, but you do have, at least in the archetype, in the personality, you both are eliciting sweetness. So what he's showing here is that there is a process that not just jumps from yesh ma'ayin, that suddenly you have sweetness out of nowhere. There is a sweetness in the mazel that in turn, when it becomes nizgashim and nisavim, becomes thickens and becomes material, that sweetness turns into a physical sweetness. So you say, so what was the Havamina? What was the question then? Why didn't he say that originally? Because originally, he was not talking about a spiritual sweetness. He was just saying that how from a seed which has no sweetness in it, or from the power in the earth that has no sweetness in it, how does suddenly sweetness come out? How do you have a tangible personality? What he's answering is that in those levels, in the mazel particularly, especially according to the Rashi and the Medrash, that tasting the earth, so obviously there is, sweetness goes through a hishtalshlus. Now I want to just illuminate this point before I continue. Let me just finish the chapter. So he says, the 10 hidden spheres are like the sweetness in the mazel. There's a concept of sweetness, chachma bina, and that will be the root, and that will be then once you plant the seed in the ground. So then he says, once you plant this chachma from Esesphere Sagnuzis into the ground, let's call it the existence after the tzimtzum, that causes it to have a gashmizdika element to it, and then the sweetness becomes physical. Now remember, Atzilus is also spiritual. We're talking relative to the 10 hidden spheres, the 10 revealed spheres, is like the sweetness of an apple compared to the sweetness of a song, or the spiritual sweetness in the mazel. That's the analogy that he uses here. And then he concludes and says one more thing. This sweetness, however, the apple, does not reflect the real core sweetness of the mazel. The mazel happens to have also a spiritual dimension that's called spiritual sweetness, but it's only a reflection of this. That's why it's called er zerua. So we have here, because you could say if that's the case, then why is it like a seed? Then it would be like shefa, like an actual seed, like water, like he says. You take a level above and you move it down to another level. It remains er, because the mazel still remains fundamentally a spiritual entity that's beyond sweetness and beyond personality. So er remains a reflection. Er is still an expression of the source, which is beyond all these structures. But nevertheless, a reflection of it manifests in what we'll call spiritual sweetness, and that reflection will ultimately become, when it's planted in Atzilus, it will become er zerua, will become an actual tangible sweetness, which is the sweetness or the levels or the distinction of the spheres in Atzilus. Kim k'may er zerua sh'adei agar nazerua ha'orem misavim misgashim k'may kin ha'eres des esfiris and k'may er zerua sheba b'aksham legabe mekeri ad shenikra b'shem er ha'chachma. I want to just elaborate a moment and then we'll continue the next chapter. The ideas in this chapter were discussed in general terms earlier about how it evolves, but what he's doing here is obviously adding many key points in the process. Now, the first point I wanted to make was this. There's an expression that what brings together a soul and a body is a koyach hamafli lasis. It's only a power, a mafli, that is a completely awesome and mysterious power that can bring together gashmis and ruchnis. How could spirit meet matter? There's no real way to explain it. The only way you can explain it is that there's something that is beyond spirit and matter that's able to bring them together. Because without that, these two are separate entities. And yet, at the same time, we see that we don't just say that God miraculously does it. He does it with a system. There's a system. We have a heart that beats. We breathe. There's a whole process of how life is generated. And if God forbid there's illness, there's ways to heal. You don't just say, oh, if the soul and body are having a problem, pray to God and He should bring you together. No, there's ways to heal. He created a system and created medicine and gave power and permission to doctors to heal. So it means that even though at the root of it there is an element that will ultimately be mysterious, but beyond the mystery there's a lot that can be explained. And the same is true with the whole way that we work with the cosmic order. I've said this many times. God wanted to have an existence that makes sense. Does he need it that way? Could it be other way? Of course it could be, but this is where he wants it, which means this is why it has to be this way. At the root of it, you'll say, why did he need it to be logical? We don't have an answer for that. That's part of Nisava. God had desire that. He wanted Tachtenim the way they are, as we discussed, and with the logic as we understand it. It's all part of the desire. So if you go to the core and say, at the end of the road, like we go always, like, who put the first ball of gas there? The answer is, it's a mystery. And a mystery is not a problem because God is not bound by logic. So why, we have a problem with a mystery because we like to understand things. But there's a point where it began because that's how he wanted it. But because he wanted it that way, it's a real system. It's not just, who cares because he could have done it another way. No, once he made it this way, this system is the way it works. And this is also infused with the same atzmus that's beyond the structure. And therefore, understanding the logic of why you needed Tzimtzum and a Kav and Eir and Eris and Kalim and the whole process, that we don't just, why didn't God just make the miracle? A husband and wife get married, they stand under a chuppah, and the next thing you know, a baby pops up. Why does it have to go through a whole process? Why do you need even physical intimacy? I understand a scientist would not relate to that, but the whole thing is a miracle anyway. God's the one that's going to choose whether a life should be born or not be born. Why does he need a husband and wife be involved? Why does he need a process? Okay, let's say he wants them to be partners. So fine, so let them join together in a sacred way, and a child is born. Why do you need 9 months? And every step in the seed has to grow, and the fetus develops and develops and develops and develops. Then we're born, and it starts the new stages of development. We should be born bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, start doing mitzvahs. So the whole purpose, Beis is b'shil Yisrael, b'shil HaTorah. What's all this? Why months and years of waiting until we start doing Torah mitzvahs? You don't do Torah mitzvahs until you're already somewhat of an adult. Because God wanted the system to have an order. He wanted us to understand it, and wanted us to understand Him. And in some mysterious way, this order teaches us about God too. Not because God is logical, but because God shows this logic, so it teaches us about Him. And we could have a relationship, and there's a way to grow. It's not just, okay, how do I have a relationship with God? One morning I just wake up. No, you grow, you learn, and you daven, and you do a mitzvah, and you grow day by day, and you have challenges. And it's an integrated system. That's the key. If there was only Er Makif, it would be like I've said several times here, a master and a slave. We're subjects and master. God is a master and we serve the master, but that's not what God said. He said, I want you to know me. Das alekei avicha. I want you to v'yadaita, lahafta. I want you to love me. I want to have a relationship with you. A relationship means, by definition, a relationship means system. That there's two forces at work and they communicate with each other and it's back and forth, etc., etc. I'm just elaborating on this because this is a key point that often is not mentioned in any Chassidus class. And you learn, and this is like the elephant in the room if you think about it. Without this, the whole thing always remains somewhat what's going on. But this is exactly the whole reason we go through all these levels. So here we had an example in this last chapter. A seed is planted in the ground. It's a whole process. It's not just a seed planted. You have to water it. And that's why he asked the question, how did it get from here to here? Why don't you just say it's a miracle? God created a miracle. You put a seed in the ground. He gives it power to sprout. That's not correct. He says he created a mazel. And the mazel has in it a spiritual sweetness. And spiritual sweetness translates into physical sweetness. So we have a system we can follow. Okay, if that's the case, let's begin. I taste an apple, it's sweet. This teaches me about spiritual sweetness, like, let's say, sweetness of a nigun, a song, or a seichel. This teaches me in turn of spiritual sweetness even deeper than a nigun and thing. And you can, from sweetness to sweetness, all the way get to chesed or sweetness, all the way up in the Esses Sfiras Hagnuzas. And the same thing with everything in this world. Everything is not just a moshel. It's a container. Like we say, Chassidus says a moshel is actually, when we say Mepsari Echzel Lekaf, from my flesh I behold God, it's not just our bodies are an example for godliness. Our bodies, an example is the body of the soul that it is an example for. So if you want to say fire in this world, fire is just a body, a package for Gvura. Gvura is a spiritual, ethereal entity. Fire takes on shape and form. So a real makubal, or a person who sees the world for the way it is, sees everything as godly forces. It's concealed, so we only see the physical thing. So the beauty of this is that when you taste an apple, it's not just a sweet taste. The sweet taste teaches you about the higher sweetness. You have the expression, for example, the color blue. So it's tchelis deima leyam. Blue looks like, why is there tchelis and tzitzis? or in the time of the right, there was tchelis. So why tchelis? Why does it have to be blue? Why do you have blue in the Mishkan? Who cares if it's blue, red, green? God cares what color. So it says tchelis deimel yam, because tchelis is similar to the sea. Listen to this: the sea deimel lekia. Sea is similar to the sky. So the kia deimel lekisei hakoved. The sky reminds us and tells us kisei hakoved. And I don't know if there's another. I think that's where it stops. What do you see from this? Think about this. What is this Gemara saying? What is this exactly? I mean, it's just a play of words. I mean, it's like blue, blue, blue. No, we don't relate to the blueness of spirituality because we're physical creatures. God wants a dira b'tachtein. He wants us in this material world to reveal the spiritual. So He created, He planted in the color blue, and the sea is blue for a reason. Yes, I understand science has its reasons, but why are those factors? What makes water whitish blue is because it comes from the heaven, and the key is whitish blue, and the key comes from kisei hakoved. So when you evoke in you, let's say the color blue, we know today there's scientific studies and they use it in marketing. Blue evokes warmth. That's why, for example, red evokes fear. Why do you think there's red lights? Because red is known to be the color that creates a type of stop. Red evokes fire, gvura. It's a fearful color. It's a very strong color. It's a bold color. It's an aggressive color. Blue is a very gentle color. That's why water is far more gentle. When you see water, I mean, water can be dangerous too, floods, but I'm talking about water in general is a soothing experience. Fire always is terrifying, even a small fire. Now we need it. We need warmth, but fire has a power to it. It's aggressive. It's etc. etc. So the point I'm making here is that all these things are examples in this world to help us relate to the ruchnius. So if there was a jump from, let's say, Tchel is blue here, and suddenly you have to go to Atzmus, there's no bridge, there's no stepping stones. So you say, you know what, blue reminds me of the blue of the sea. So when you stand at a sea next time, you say, why is the sea blue? Well, it reminds me of the blueness on a more ethereal level of the heavens. And from there to kisei hakoved and so on. The Rebbe once explained this in a very beautiful way. You know, everyone knows this, the custom when children are, the Ayin fairnish as they call it, when we take a child first time to school, so you wrap them in a talis, there's a whole thing, and you throw them candies, and you say, Malach Machol is throwing candies. So the Rebbe once, I remember, the Rebbe even told the story of the Thickened Rebbe, that the Thickened Rebbe, out of Pesach, they found candies in his pocket. What's this? Why didn't it's Pesach coming? She said, Malach Machol threw the candies. He doesn't want to eat them up. He saved them. Did the Rebbe save the candies? Yeah. No, then they of course they got rid of them. But so the Thickened Rebbe asked the question, what kind of you're taking a child into school. This is unbelievable. This is you'll see exactly what it says here in Ayin Beis. The Rebbe explaining it in very simple. You're taking a child to school. It's the foundation of a child's education. There's going to be enough lies the child's going to feed. You have to tell a child a lie to a child, and Malach Machol throwing the candies. We all know the parents are throwing the candies. So what kind of Malach Machol? And the parents didn't throw the candies. The Rebbe asked this question. I heard it myself more than one Fabring. It's printed. There's a sikha, I think, in Chelik Chelik Tazayin. Anyway, so the question, lying to a child will grow a little older and say, Malach Machol threw me the candies, and if you didn't throw them, would you have also thrown them? And then of course, the Rebbe didn't say this. I'm saying this. I grew up with this, that Elio comes, Pesach, and drinks the wine. And my uncles and everybody made sure to kick the table, so we're fooled 1 year, 2 years, until we find out someone's kicking the table. No one's sipping no wine, And you say, what's this? So I know it's small little jokes, but at some point you start saying, so what is this whole thing? Is this like real or that? What else did they just tell me is a story? What's real? What's not real? So the Rebbe asked this question. He says, so that's how you mechanech a child? You tell a child, and the child will grow a little older. Okay, the child then is naive, is accepted. You say, Malach Machol, fine, Malach Machol. Grows a little older. We'll find out whether there was no Malach that came. That was the Rebbe's question. And the Rebbe answered with another question. He said like this. That, B'chlal, we teach children, Chanech L'Apidak, you teach children, you don't tell them, learn Torah, because Torah is godly. God says learn. We tell them to learn Torah, because we'll give you a reward. There was a custom, and some still have the custom, that the first time children learn Aleph Beis, you smear the sheet of Aleph Beis, some learn it from the Sharblat of Tanya, whatever, they smear it with honey and sugar. And then they say, the Rebbe said actually, the niggin, Torah is the best of schei, the best of mervi rojin kesem mandlin. more than raisins and almonds. There's a song that grandmothers would sing to their grandchildren, or mothers sing, that the raisins and almonds are very sweet, but Torah is even sweeter. So the Rebbe asked the question, what kind of chinuch is this? You're teaching children that they should do it for a reward. You give them a reward, or because it's sweet, because they're going to get something that's sweet. Why don't you just tell them that this is what God wants? It's the sweetest thing in the world. That's it. So, of course, the answer, the Rambam himself asked this question. In Akdamah to Pirush HaMishnayos, he asked the question. The whole yesod of chinuch is we teach children, adults as well, to do it for ulterior motives. He said, "Le'elim yasik adam b'teira mitzvah shalei l'shma, b'teich shalei l'shma bo l'shma." Right? It should always le'elam, which means that's the original way, not b'diavad, not if you have no choice. Le'elam, initially, you teach someone to do Torah mitzvahs shalei l'shma, for ulterior motive, whatever that is, physical reward, spiritual reward, whatever gets it done. And b'teich shalei l'shma, because from shalei l'shma it will come to l'shma. So the question is asked, what kind of lechatchila is this? B'diavad we understand. A person may not be at the level that they can appreciate God wants you to do it. Fine. So we give in, we compromise and say. But to say la'elam, initially that's the way. So all these questions are answered, but we just learned it. The answer is no. When the parents are throwing the candies, it is al malach machol. But malach machol manifests in the shliach is the parent. Now, malach machol, a child cannot yet understand spiritual like that. So it manifests in physical things. When we have sweetness, why is there sugar and honey in this world? Not because there's sugar and honey and now we figure out how that teaches us something. No, there's sugar and honey in this world because there's spiritual sweetness. That spiritual sweetness, Nisava and Nisgashim, becomes sugar and honey. Sugar and honey is spiritual sweetness in a physical body. The fact that we don't know that's because there are limited. So that's why Le'elim Yaseh, because we're material human beings. So the Gemara is being very practical and saying, Le'elam, this is the way we work. You cannot begin by appreciating the spiritual. You have to begin by appreciating it by you. And that's why the interpretation, Meteich Shalei Lishma, like the Rebbe says, Meteich, the Teich of Shalei Lishma, not only that Shalei Lishma brings, the meaning of Leil Lishma, the real inside of the candies, and Malach Machal, is not the candies, it's the spiritual, but the child can only understand it on that level. So same thing you could say, a teacher gives an example when he teaches, he's being false. Why doesn't he just explain the idea? Why do you give me an example? No one's ever going to say anything like that, but just think for a moment. It's like, what deceptive? I have to give you an example? Example of something that's not the topic? Talk about the topic. The answer is very simple. The topic may be too abstract, may be too beyond us. So we need an example that we relate to. The example is something you can hold on to. But the example is the idea manifest in this lavush. It's just a lavush. The problem is if you forget that it's a lavush and you think the sweetness is an end in itself. I mentioned this piece. It's an unbelievable thing. The Rebbe, the former beauty queen of Israel went by dollars, right? And you'd think that the Rebbe nobody would believe what the Rebbe said to her. So she went by, the Rebbe called her back. Everyone thought that maybe the Rebbe didn't understand. She said she's a former beauty queen. She asked for a bracha, for atzlacha, shidduch, and so on. It was all spiritual thing. It wasn't. She asked for a spiritual bracha. The Rebbe calls her back. She's a former beauty queen. He says to her that even though it says sheker achein v'hevel hayefi, right? That false is chein, grace, and hevel and folly, and vanity is beauty. Beauty is vanity. Nevertheless, and what is that? Ki yirsha yiras Hashem hitisalo. That the true virtue that you praise a woman is Yiras Hashem. The Rebbe said, but the interpretation in it is that once you have the Isha Yiras Hashem, that infuses also the beauty and the Chen and the Yefi. That's the interpretation. It's not the literal interpretation, but you have to say this. The Rebbe didn't explain. I'll explain. Well, based on what is the Rebbe saying this? The Pasuk doesn't say that. The reason is very simple. Look in Chumash, and we talk about the virtues of Sarah, of the Imais, Yefas Teyar, Yefas Mada, Yefi. So how could suddenly in Mishlei Shlomo Melech say Sheker Achein Hevel Yefi? You could say certain Achein and Yefi. You can't just have a blanket statement to say that all grace and Chein. Neyach Motza Chein Be'enei Hashem. Chein, since when is Chein a negative?
All three Imais had Yefi.
Right, exactly. And Yefi, and when we say in Torah, Zeh Keli Vanveyu, that you do a mitzvah, Misnoah Lefonecha Lefonov b'mitzvahs. To make a beautiful cloth, a beautiful parchment, beautiful sefer Torah, beautiful mezuzah, beautiful Shabbos table. Since when is beauty? So it's a basic question on the pasuk. So the pasuk is not coming to say that Yefi and Chen are bad. It's saying only that they're empty. When you have the Yiras Hashem, then the real purpose of the Yefi, the beauty. Now we live in a world that is a material world. And beauty in this world, even beauty that's very coarse beauty, comes from somewhere. Beauty doesn't come from nowhere. God created this world. If something is beautiful, it means it has a beautiful root. The fact that humans use it for something that could be decadent or selfish, that's the same question with the Roman asked Rabbi Akiva, why didn't God destroy the world? Why didn't God destroy the sun and the moon? Because people, that way you won't have sun and moon worshippers. So he said, because of the fools, God's going to destroy his world. Because there are fools who don't understand the meaning of beauty or gold, which was created for the Beis Hamikdash. That's why God's going to destroy it. You know, the whole basis of the Rebbe's approach to technology. These are godly forces in the world. God forbid to say humans created them. Humans can hijack them. Fine. So that's our mission. So you see here, it's a whole take, and I'm elaborating because it's exactly what he said here in chapter Kuf Lamed Aleph, except not in such elaborate terms. That Mesikus Gashmi comes from Mesikus Ruchni, and it leads you step by step by step. And that's what the Avos did. Erzaru al Tzadik. That's how I would sum up chapter 131 in more, let's call palatable terms that can be explained to anybody.
Palatable from palate.
There you go. Right. The Baal Shem Tov says, by the way, very interesting thing, which can only be explained by this Ayin Beis here. He says that why do we have different tastes and preferences? Some people like certain foods, other people don't like them. He says because the neshama senses the sparks in these foods. He says even when you're attracted to something of beauty, he even mentions a beautiful woman and so on and so forth. He says it's because your neshama relates to that type of beauty. Now obviously you need Torah to tell you what's kedusha, what's not. But beauty, and you're drawn to it, is because the neshama is recognizing a deeper spiritual beauty that manifests in physical beauty. It's basically the idea. I mean, if you think about it, it's not a fundamental chiddush, but most people never heard it. It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. It means even down to our most physical pleasures. The root of a pleasure, of being attracted to something, I'm talking about the positive of it, comes from the neshama. Now, you could say, well, what happens when we have taivas to things that are completely forbidden? Fine, we're not talking about that. That, of course, the nefesh habamis is also a factor in having, as I said, you can use beauty for negative reasons. But we're talking about the beauty of the thing. We're not talking about how it's used in a negative way.
Are we attracted to things that are the opposite or the same things as we have in our level?
If you're attracted to...
Well, let's say you're walking down the street, you see something beautiful.
Right.
We won't say a human being. You see a beautiful tree. The Mishnah says, Ma yafa ilanzeh. Ma no ilanzeh. Ma yafa. You know, how beautiful. If you just say it's a beautiful tree, and I'm going to watch and observe it, and I'll take a picture of it to make a painting, so maybe that's reshus, maybe. But if you say, look how beautiful, this means it reflects, like we said before, blue reflects on heaven. This is beautiful, it shows the God's beauty. Then you're seeing in creation God has manifested a part of His beauty. So that's up to us to determine whether we're going to.
It's the root of the soul. So is it something lacking in the root of the soul, or something we have?
No, we have. Different souls have sparks that they relate to.
Okay, so
Yeah.
It's not like looking for an opposite. No. It's more the soul identifies with that because that's another point, but that's not the point in the Baal Shem Tov. The point Baal Shem Tov actually says foods. And even things even humans that we're attracted to, and images and stuff like that. He refers to basically our preferences, that why people have different personalities, and what they consider beautiful and so on. So it's really basically understanding that the world is not controlled by the devil, the world is controlled by God. The only thing is, it's concealed. So when you see something beautiful, it can either be something you indulge in a negative way, or it's reshus, you're just neutral, or you elevate it to something positive. I remember the famous sikha where the Rebbe spoke. I prepared it for print, for publication. The Rebbe edited it. When he was talking about children, not to expose children to animals that are not pure or clean. To behemoths tmei, chayes tmeis. The Rebbe actually he said, of all things that's glorified in America is a mouse. Mickey Mouse. Now Mickey Mouse happens to be cute. It's not like a mouse that's running around that we are repulsed by. But the Rebbe then was asked a lot of questions. What about going to the zoo then? What about showing children people learn nature. They learn tigers and bears and these are not kosher animals. And the Rebbe made it very clear. He was talking things that where you have an option. On the contrary, he says, you go to a zoo, he said, the Rebbe said like this, if you take children to a zoo, he says, the biggest malamet tenekis of all, the greatest, teachers asked the question, what should teachers do when they teach children? So he said, the biggest teacher of all children was Rashi. And you see, when it comes to Nevis and so on, Rashi describes animals that are, the Torah talks about rabbits and other animals that are not kosher. So when we're talking in Torah to understand the world that God created, or to understand Marabu Masecha, you go to a zoo and you see an elephant, and you're teaching children this is greatness that God created. You see power, you see the things that a lion teaches us. On the Kadra, we say every day, have a kal kanamar, right? Ratz katzvi. 3 of those animals are not kosher animals, right? No, 3 or 4 even. What do we say? Ratz kanamar is a leopard. No, tzvi is a gazelle. Okay, that's kosher animal. But gibber kari, ari is not kosher. A nomer is a leopard is not, and and what is it? And kanesha, an eagle is not. Nevertheless, they're God's creations. The Gemara says, if we didn't have the mountain Torah, God forbid, the Rabbi Rashab adds, we would learn tznius from what? From a cat. So to say that the animals in the world are, God forbid, negative animals, the Rebbe was speaking in a home where you have a choice. If you have to bring a stuffed animal, bring a kosher stuffed animal. So it's just an image of more tar. Because some people took it completely out of context. They thought the Rebbe meant, that's it, let's kill all the leopards and lions and then zoos and so on and so forth. You know, I mean, I'm just trying to point out it all has to be with context.
I'm glad you said that, because a lot of people do think so.
Yeah.
They distorted the whole thing.
Everything is with balance. Look, the Rebbe has in a letter a very interesting thing. You're not allowed to, a horse is not kosher, but you can ride on a horse and go do a mitzvah with it. So the question is a horse shalosh klippos atmeis or klippos nega?
Even some of the shvatim are compared to not kosher animals.
That's also brought in the Sichot. The golem, the flags had images of a serpent, had images of Remember, creatures are created by God, and they all have a purpose in this world. The spider, etc., etc. Okay, let's learn Kuf Lamed Beis. Okay, this was a little trying to bring Ayin Beis, but you see, the ideas of Ayin Beis can be related, mamish, to things that are down to Mickey Mouse even. Don't write an article called Ayin Beis and Mickey Mouse. That's going to be very odd. Kuf Lamed Beis. V'hinei. So we concluded that this is Er Zerua. Er Zerua, that the Ovis accomplished is Er Zerua, that what? It's Er. So it's not the Etzem Mazel, it's not the Etzem, the core source of the 10 sphere, of the divine, but a reflection of it. But that reflection is a spiritual sweetness, evolves and becomes actual sweetness in Atzilus. That's Er Zerua. So it's planted like a seed. A seed that's planted, and once it grows, suddenly you have a sphere. It's a beautiful imagery, actually, how spheres emerge. So God planted spheres like He planted seeds. Yes? Yeah. So what we learned before was the 10 hidden spheres, was the artist envisioning envisioning the structure of existence. Now we're calling them seeds that are planted in Atzilus, and that's where they grow into spheres as we know them.
You say sweetness is a muscle for tainig?
I wouldn't use tainug here, because sweetness is maybe more of a chesed, if anything. Because tainug would confuse matters. Besikus is more of a muscle for personality of a sphere, I would say. Every sphere has its personality. V'hinei ba'moshel, now he continues. Now v'hinei, and now ba'moshel, an example, had a neshama, had a hakshamas ha'ara, why they hagarin hanizra. What was the example? Let's go back to the example. That God took the power of creation, put that into the earth. Now you take a seed, let's say an apple seed. The seed itself, if you did not know what an apple tastes like, you would not know that this seed is going to yield an apple tree. That you'll be able to eat apples and know and have a sweet taste, because the seed has nothing similar in it, right? Yet what happens is that the mazel of this seed is telling it that once it becomes an apple, it's telling it this apple should have sweetness, because the mazel has a form of sweetness. So in the mashal, hariakshamis ha'ara, the so-called the thickening of the coarsening of the reflection. What's the reflection? He's talking about Er Zerua, the reflection of the mazel, spiritual sweetness. In the example, it's through the planted seed. So it's not just that there is a spiritual sweetness that enters the earth, and the earth yields a tree. You need an intermediary, another interface. It's called a seed.
You need to plant a seed. Because technically God could have made it that way. He could have said, different parts of the earth, if you water it, the earth will yield an apple tree, and I will infuse it with sweetness from a higher level. No, you need the seed. So you can explain now what is the seed in the analogy. So every detail is critical here. I think this is really fascinating because I think for the first time, remember yesterday I said that to really appreciate these levels, it's been very good to look at the gestation process of any growth, whether it's a conception of a child to delivery, of a fetus, or a seed in the ground. That really to understand the shtalshlus is expressed in the metamorphoses that we see in our lives. And the fact that, I think any metamorphosis that we can identify in the physical world can be a perfect example for metamorphosis from the higher spiritual worlds to the physical worlds. I'm saying this for a reason. Because if we're going to ever map out this human genome, the spiritual genome, if we're going to ever map out Ishtalshlus, I think the way to do it is to use models, biological, anatomical, what's the word? I want to say physics. Models in physics of how things metamorphosize from a state of a nucleus to they become a full-blown entity. Huh? Yeah. Even chemical reactions and chemical processes. I think it would be excellent. That would be a real good collaboration because you could actually probably find Akudim, Vikudim, Vrudim, Atzilas, Bri, Yitzira, 10 hidden spheres. If you can find that in so-called existing scientific models, I think that there would be real revelations would come out of that. Because imagine a scientist, let's say a chemist, would learn from this and say, you know what, based on this, he discovered another level of a chemical process, and he wins a Nobel Prize. Then we get Ayin Beis will receive the fame it deserves, and Chassidus will control the world. What do you think? Does this make sense? I really think this to me is absolutely doable. I have no doubt that it's doable. If you map this out properly and sat with people who really know their science, I'm saying it for the record. I want to say, if any of you know someone like this, to me is worth every second, because that would really be something unbelievable. Because as long as it remains in the books here, it will not be taken credibly by people who just don't know what this is. Well, if you can associate the two, so I think the fact that he's giving an example of seeds. I mean, I'm going to go back. I want to study what botanists say about how a seed actually, how the process, because it's a mystery even in science. It's not so simple. Seeds, what happens? What does the earth do? Why, if you put a seed on the ground, it's just on a table, it won't grow. What is a seed anyway? So I'm sure there's some descriptions of it, but the question is how evolved they are. And if you compare it to what he says here, it would be very interesting to parallel. You don't agree with that? I'm fascinated by these things. I don't know about you. What do you think?
So let's know what he says there.
I once heard from Professor Yankel Brouwer, who does research.
In Montreal, yeah.
And they were doing some research in a certain thing of some DNA in the pituitary gland. And the only place that they found that DNA in another place in the body was in Zera. And so that Indian of how...
It says in Tanya, right? Zera Meyacha'av.
Machshavi, that's how comes Zera.
That's amazing. That's been established? Is this established? I mean, this is like a common...
I believe so.
I mean, a haploid amount of chromosomes,
Yeah, because the Tanya, we've always learned you don't have to necessarily physically, you just say, definitely Zera does not just come. That's why Ein Kisha El Das. I mean, Zera isn't just a physical secretion. It's clearly coming, has the power to give, to fertilize the seed. So clearly it's much more than just another secretion.
Right.
But that makes it definitely far more, No, my point I'm saying is not everything has to be taken. Even here, I wouldn't say necessarily literally every step, but definitely conceptually to find the parallels. The more, the better. I'm surprised that Professor Brouwer or these people like that, once they get into Chassidus, they start neglecting their science, which is, I understand fully why. But it'd be a big thing if someone can find the parallel. Not because we need science to corroborate it, it's because it would then be appreciated in a real way. People would realize that these levels are not just, at least if even learning Chassidus, you learn these levels, okay, another level. And you start seeing that these are processes that actually can improve our lives. I mean, even the process of how, the mysterious process, how when you press a key on a computer, how many reactions are taking place, how many chain reactions are happening right now, electrically, and then what the result
is also a very similar type of thing. It's a bunch of switches that are set in motion, and they are documented. It's not just we know exactly what's happening in every step of the process. So v'hinei b'hamoshel. So now the moshel, going back to the moshel, well, now what is this in the nimshal? What is this in the moral? Well,
So what's the Garden in Israel and Atzilus?
He says b'hamoshel.
We're talking about Atzilus now when you say Hashem Sarah.
No, he's talking about the moshel. The example was like this. We're talking here that the 10 hidden spheres, he called it. What did he say about the 10 hidden spheres? He said, spheres sagnuzis are like the sweetness in the mazel. Okay? That sweetness, once you plant a seed in Atzilus, that sweetness emerges and now takes on tangible sweetness. Like this, similar to the tangible, like this physical sweetness compared to the spiritual sweetness of a song. That's what he said.
Did he say what the seed planted in?
No, that's what he's starting to discuss now. He says in the moshel, this hakshamas ha'ara, this spiritual sweetness that became hakshama, which is a reflection of the mazel, that became coarser. So in the moshel, we find that it doesn't just become coarser. It doesn't just move from one level to the next. It's through the seed that this takes place. So he's going to explain now what is the seed here in the nimshal. In Atzilus, what is the seed? So he says we can understand this. Al pi ma shekosav be'etz chaim shar mate uloi mate perek aleph. Mate uloi mate is one of these expressions which means mate. Mate v'lei mate. To come and not to come. Right. Mate v'lei mate is like the root of ratzei and shuv. Mate uloi mate is an expression to go to extend and draw back. Perek Aleph. So there, Shamat L'Moimoti Perek Aleph, chapter 1. Sheisavas Hakelim Bakudim Hu Adei Shehimshach Esa'er. That the containers in Akudim, and remember Akudim, there's only one container. Hu Adei Shehimshach Esa'er. It's through drawing down the energy. V'achar Shenimshach Chazav V'Nistalach Ha'er Hu L'Mayla. And after this energy was drawn down, it returned, chazar, it returned and expired, returned back to its source, ha'ula maila, legabe mekere. It returns back, legabe mekere means it returns back into its source. That's what mati ulemati actually is. So it's like an energy that extended outward and then it went back, returned. Umaniach reshim, this is all the Eitz Chaim, let's read it and then we'll explain. Umaniach reshim, and it left an impression. Reshim chesim lamata, left an impression like a chesim of like a seal below. Like in other words, it wasn't just a light that emerged and returned, but the light that emerged actually left an impression and a seal below. V'zeh reshim nasa b'chinas kli adei richa ka'er mimeno. And this impression is what became a container through the distance of the energy that returned. In other words, the distance of the energy that left it. Can you show me? Give me the Eitz Chaim a moment. As I think I mentioned several times, Ayin Beis and Eitz Chaim are very much connected. There's a constant explanations of Eitz Chaim all over the place. Okay, Shem Mati Loi Moti, where's that? Okay. Learning Eitz Chaim in depth, it's not easy. Trust me. Here we go. Shem Mati Loi Moti, Perek Aleph. I just want to see, because there's something here, it's not so clear completely. Here we are. Let me see what he says here, if we could see something from inside. You want to learn some Eitz Chaim, my friends? You never learn Eitz Chaim?
That's why I think we have to go.
Kfar b'yanu ben Gatzilus Elin Hischalias Bakudim Nekudim V'Rudim V'Ater Nachzor Levayar Ayin Be'erav Matsis Hakudim Ayin Yanam. So here's what he says here. Before there was the existence of Akudim, the higher energy was not able to manifest in any container. Because containers could not contain, tolerate, but could not contain the and also the energy was not manifestable in a container. Until this extension of the energy reached the level of Akudim,
And there became the emergence. Think of again the seed. Let's go back to conception of a child. Okay, so as soon as you have an egg is fertilized by a seed, so now you have a cell. A container has been established. It's minuscule, but something has established. It's essentially what akudim is. The first container begins to emerge. V'oz hischil atzilis liyas by eze mitzias hagbolas ha'er, mashloi ha'yelach liyas hadover adata. And then Atzilus, now remember Atzilus here doesn't mean the world of Atzilus. Atzilus means the emanation of energy. It will become Atzilus. Atzilus is when this seed gives birth and you have a child. But the beginning of Atzilus is Akudim, essentially. So he says, this gives it, I'm reading it because it's not difficult to understand what he's saying here. I think it'll be a lot easier to understand the Ayin Beis. Remember, we don't say Chassidus' explanation of Kabbalah, Kabbalah's explanation of Chassidus. So now we're going to see how Kabbalah explains Ayin Beis. What do you think about that? Even though this came earlier, but remember, Machshava Gdum Da'ak.
Even though it came earlier, that's the explanation.
It's not about actual time.
Listen, remember the Netanya, the first part of time.
Not, by the way, that's it's not the first time you say such a thing. You know, you say, for example, Teira Be'elam Haz is Hevel Hu L'gabe Teira Shel Mashiach. But without the Teira, like Talmud B'Yodei, you wouldn't be able to get there. So real Teira will learn Losad Loving, or even mitzvahs. According to some, it's Siyunim today. So sometimes something comes before, without, right. It's only it's a china. But once you learn that, you realize that this was just it's not unheard of. It's a concept.
It's like the Sefer Ben.
So let's continue. So here we say it's a very important expression. What was not able to be till now. I think this is excellent because what was the neshama like if there's no is there a scientific word for the moment that I know conception is, but what happens the first second that the fetus, it's not called even a fetus at that point?
Zygote.
Huh?
A zygote.
That's really? Well, anyway, that moment creates a container, and now the soul has somewhere to manifest. Without that, there's no soul to manifest. Okay, so he says, "Omnam tchila ha'er kulei shel chalokim hamagim latzilus kulam nelam techlei echad levad." In the beginning, all the soul energy of parts that would come into Atzilus were all concealed in this one container. Okay, then he goes through the process that then becomes 10 containers, nukudim, and so on. Let me skip to where it's relevant. That's nukudim, 10 containers.
I can't believe I'm going to get a chance to translate this.
There is a translation, but I don't know if it's going to help much.
Translate it.
Okay, here we go. Here's the expression now. What did he do?
Good question.
When he wanted to make this thing called akudim, the beginning of containers, what did he do? Oh boy. He extended an energy, he transmitted an energy. So think of it, the source is transmitting an energy.
Mati.
Yeah, exactly. 1 second. Basically extended it to the structure that he wanted to create, through Adat Tabur, till the navel. Basically, okay, that's an Ak Adam Karma. Let's not go there. Remember, this is all structured like similar to a human being. Here goes. And after extending it, exactly what he says here. The energy returned ha'er hahu lamayla b'mkeireh. He says legabe mkeireh. This is the language he says. It returned back to its source, bepeh. in the mouth. So basically, he's not saying the levels, but extended to the navel and returned to the mouth. Which is interesting. The Gemara Taka says there's two opinions. A child does begin to develop from the mouth, from the peh, or from the tablet, right? Am I right? Or chaitim. Okay, anyway, return to the mouth. And it's not relevant to the navel or the mouth. It's just an analogy of levels. And it's known that this energy, that once it extended, think of it like this. Just trying to find a good example. You have an energy that's contained, and then it bursts forth into an area that never saw this energy before. And it will return. Think of it like a burst of lightning. But he says you have to say if it came out, it must leave a mark. That's what he's saying, that it leaves some mark. That's what he's saying here. So it must leave some mark. He says must be. Yeah, it's exactly what he said here. So basically saying that when the energy returned, what mark did it leave? It left something that would become a container. It's an interesting imagery. So what, if the energy had remained there, the container could not emerge because the energy would be too powerful. So, but the fact that it burst forth like a lightning bolt and returned, what it left was, since the energy is not here, but it left a mark, it left an impression, and that impression is the beginnings of one's energy is gone of the container. And then Rasa B'chinas Keli, Ki Sibis is Pasha Service, Talgus Achar Goram Lasses Mitzis Klil Lefish Nishra Er Al Gozer Stalgay Mistalg Bas Achar Zabrego Lachin Kol Mitzis Er Nishra Nasnak Mitzis Klil Nikar B'chinas Klil Nikar Keser. He says this Keli is called Keser. I'm saying that for your benefit, just for the picture. Bas Achas, one second. Stalig Babas Achas or Berek Achas Lachin Kol Mitzis. Kedain Er Elin Loi Hoyeb Nivdal B'Yitzviris. Kedain Loi Hoyeb Nikar Yesh Yitzviris and Mashanikar Keser V'Leis Virachez Atamu Kila Elam HaKeser Kodav Elamaitzel. Wow. Vini HaKol Min HaKlei Adish Nasha Yitzon Nikus Keser B'Vadach Masha Yitzon Very nice. Okay, I would say the following is what's happening here. Okay, so he's using this Eitz Chaim now to explain the seed, what the seed is. So he says, "V'zeh hareishim yeshleimer." This reishim that we just discussed in Eitz Chaim yeshleimer, we can say shezeu kamei al derech moshla hagarin. That's like, for example, like the seed shaboy va'yodei, that in it and through it nitzmach hapri, the fruit will grow, will blossom. Like this is like the Reishim Anal, this impression that we just mentioned, from it grew and emerged the 10 spheres that are rooted in Ak. So it goes like this. Adam Kadman is just energy. Think of it as energy that encompasses all of existence. Sometimes it says it's the Sheir Shei Neshamas Shebegufim. So think of Ak as a reservoir of energy. It's after the Tzimtzum. It's all the energy, but it's not an energy that we don't yet have a creation. If you want to think of it in context of our discussion here, think of it like the moment before conception. So God has decided that a soul will enter this world, but He's not yet determined where the soul is going to enter. Then husband and wife conceive, and the energy from Ak enters now into this fertilized egg, right? But there's an initial bolt, and then the power of the energy from the source is removed, and a container begins to grow, and together it will start developing. In other words, there's something that remains, and that's what remains is called the seed. That's called a fertilized seed, basically. A seed that has begun to grow, not God forbid, a dead seed. A seed that's begun to grow, that has the ability to grow. That's the beginning. That's what he says is the Reishim. That's where the container begins. So the beginning of the container is the seed. That's the role of the seed.
What is fertilization?
Well, fertilization is God planting it, basically. God wanting it. He's planting it.
That's the Reishim.
The Esespheres Agnuzus is the root of the Mesikus, as you said. That's like that's the sweetness in the mazel, but that's above. After Atzilus, these spheres are now planted. What's the seed? The seed is the air that returns and leaves an impression that becomes the beginning of the container. In this container, everything will start now emerging. As this container develops, and more air begins to spread into it, it'll blossom, and it'll become a tree. It'll become an apple tree. And then you'll eat an apple, it'll have physical sweetness that originates from the sweetness of the mazel. But you have something to hold on to. That's called the container. The seed is the beginning of the physical tree. In other words, the interface between a spiritual mazel that's telling the apple to be sweet, which is still spiritual sweetness, and the actual apple is the seed. And the seed is the beginning of the container in Nakudim. It works very well. It's beautiful. And Nakudim would be when it develops more. And then Nakudim is an Thickened, is where it becomes not Atzilus, it becomes a full-blown entity. It works.
Is there any chaos in it?
He's not discussing that here. It's not relevant there.
It's very good. He says the navel. The navel
You mentioned it
goes
went
to
through
the
the
center.
It goes through
And
the
the
Kudim.
center and the-
Kudim, but the Kudim has a purpose. The Kudim means that it develops into 10 levels.
Says the navel. The navel is the whole source of nutrition.
No, it makes a lot. It could be very well. That's very good. The navel will become the umbilical cord. Yeah. And it taka flows like an air and keli, very minimal. Because the navel, it's just it's a flow of energy. Look, when he says Reshim and leaves a mark, we understand that there's some connection to the air, but it's a very minimal. It's almost like, I'm thinking to myself, teacher-student, infinitely distant, and the teacher comes and appears for the first time, so there's a certain power there. The teacher has entered the room, and he says something, and then he's quiet. So he's created now the beginnings of a container of a relationship. Now begins the process of growth. It works very well, this. You see that Rebbe Rashab is working hard in explaining every aspect of the mashal. And we can say, all these Yashlemis clearly tell you this is the Chiddush of the Rebbe Rashab. So this is real Rebbe Rashab, classic. I want to see if there's anything written earlier, but it looks to me very much original Rebbe Rashab here. There's a lot of Yashlemis here. They're just like the containers of Atzilus confine the energy, and it's explained elsewhere that what is the Agbala? We learned this earlier too. The Agbala is not that the energy in Atzilus is limited. It doesn't let the flow. It's like it's a filter that doesn't let it go out of Atzilus. The example given for it, let's say a hand, when you can write many infinite letters, but your hand is stopping the flow, and you only write an aleph and a beis. So the hand still can write infinitely, but the flow stop is only outside of the hand, outside of the arm. Because in Atzilus, the spheres are still, they're chesed gvura, but chesed, infinite chesed. Gvura, infinite gvura. The gamma kelim d'Atzilus ain't b'chinas gvul adayim, because also the containers of Atzilus are not yet really complete gvul. U'kamayim and midosin eser she'en lehem sof. Like the Maimon, their measure is 10, but they have no end. He brought this earlier. This is from a Sefer Yitzhak problem. They have 10, but each one has no end. So yes, they are already a structure of 10 spheres, but each one of them is endless in its flow within Atzilus.
You can't say that about Biyah?
Biyah, you can't say endless flow. No. Then the Biyah is both Chesed has a stop.
But we also learned that a few weeks ago that in Biyah there's in the finite is infinite. So
What we learned here or elsewhere?
Here, right here.
I don't know what you mean. Tell me what you mean with the finite.
About Atzilus,
When you say spheres from the word misper, number, you mean? First of all, we're talking about Atzilus. Yes, exactly. And once number comes in Biyah, it is finite. No, look, remember, there's Atzilus in Biyah too. We're talking about Biyah on its own. Obviously, the point is that even in this finite world, we can reveal all this. But we're talking about in the way it's initially created. Mashiach comes, we'll be able to bring Bligvul into Gvul, but that's not what we're discussing here. Here we're discussing how the structure is. Atzil is therefore a structure, but it's in himself. Like the Pardes writes and explained elsewhere. The confinement is that outside of Atzilus, the energy should only flow, only affect in a limited way. That means, and that is the Hainu, that is the creation of Biyah. But this is all a Kamei Kain, so let's go back. Let's go read it properly. That says now he's going back. Kamei Kain. Kamei Kain b'chinas hakeli da'kudim poel ba'er shebam shachos b'atzilus yeh b'chinas mitzias.
Compared to that.
Same thing. The container in akudim, which is still only one small container, the seed, it affects the da'er that when it flows, when it extends into atzilus yeh b'chinas mitzias. It should be in a form of mitzias. Very interesting. I'm glad we're going slowly here, my friend. This is not easy reading here. Wow. This is fascinating. He's now explaining the role of the seed. Let's explain the role of the seed. I'm smiling because it's just really, the dissecting here of every level is just unbelievable. So we're talking about a metamorphosis from a state that is completely ethereal, okay, to a state that's completely tangible and concrete. It's not a simple matter, but we have examples, as I said. Here the example of the seed is a perfect example. If you want to talk about it even more detail, you could say on the third day of creation, God said, Asar Mamaras, the third mimer was what? Or the fourth mimer? Tacha Oretz Desha. He commanded, he said, that Tacha Oretz Desha, the earth shall bear growth. And it basically empowered earth with the power of growth. So clearly this is a spiritual force informing and creating the ability for growth in this earth. We learned before in the Geras HaKodesh that he cited earlier. He said, very interesting expression, he said like this. I just want to read it because it's very helpful here. That God planted a keiche v'yacholti b'yisei da'ofer agashmi b'gili otzum b'yeser eiz m'yisei d'selyen. He empowered earth more than all the other higher elements, more than fire, water, and wind and air, with the power to be able to give to sprout endlessly. Tamid yesh ma'ayin, grasses and trees endlessly. And it's all coming from a spiritual power. So 1 second. Now the reason is I'm quoting this because this is very much similar language that he uses here. So he says an interesting expression. 1 second, give me a second. Where is it? That's this pale bekedav aretz tamid le'elam vad. He says not only b'sheshis me'bereishis b'vad, but he gave power to earth forever, to end of time, to constantly cause things to grow. He says it's a taste of Ein Sof in this world. Here it goes. Latzmiach asavim v'ilanos, to grow grasses and trees, upedas and fruits, ma'ayin liyash, from nothing into something, tamid, always, midishana b'shana, year after year, shume'ein b'chinas ein seif, which is like a taste of Ein Sof. She'im yiskayim elam hazeh ribu devav shanim, because if elam hazeh would continue, this is Tanya, for many, many years, ribu devav, what is that, tens of thousands of years, yatzmichu midishana b'shana, it would continue to grow year after year, then he continues on that there's two types of growth, things that we plant, and there are things that we okay, I'm going to have to conclude because my wife has to leave, but let me just sum this up here. Put them down, Shandy, I'll take care of it.
Svichim grows by
Right, things that grow by themselves and things that are planted. Now, Why am I saying this? Because, why was I saying it? So the question, however, is what he's saying now. So the process is like this. The seed, what does the seed do? You have the spiritual concept of sweetness already in the 10 hidden spheres. What does the seed do? The seed gives it substance, but very minimal substance. So he's saying the seed does for Atzilus what Atzilus does for Biyah. Atzilus is already substance, but it's endless chesed, endless gvura. So it stops the process outside of Atzilus. Akudim, the seed, what it does is it stops the spirituality of it and gives it some type of substance. So the seed is closer to the tree than it is to the spiritual power of growth. That's what he's saying. So the seed itself is still a seed, but it's going to cause that ultimately there will become a substantial tree called an apple tree. Same thing like Atzilus. Atzilus creates a tree, but it creates an infinite tree. And in Biyah, it creates a limited element. It's basically showing how the interfaces are such that they begin to give you a new entity, but it's still only limited outside of itself. But it itself, the seed itself, is still somewhat of an infinite entity. That's what he's saying here. So just like Atzilus, the main limitation of the containers of Atzilus is that it shouldn't flow out of Atzilus. The main limitation of the container of the seed is that it should allow it to become substance in Atzilus. Okay. Let's stop here because it's going to have to get a slow process because he's analyzing this Eitz Chaim. So we'll stop here. We did the beginning of chapter 132, page 255, top of 256.